Hey guys, and welcome to the Performance Hub Podcast, and thanks for tuning in. So before we get started, we want to let you guys know about an amazing offer we have going at the moment. Using the coupon code COMMUNITY, we have 1 month free access to the Performance Hub. So this is our online members site where we have tons of content from in-depth exercise tutorials, videos on different strength and conditioning methods, program templates, articles on nutrition, stress management, and just a ton more content. So head over to www.pipeperformance.uk to sign up and get started on that today. As well as that, below this video, we've linked all our social media channels, as well as all of our guest socials. So go and like and comment and share, as it really helps us to be able to produce more content for you guys, like the interview that we had today. Okay, so that's enough of that. Let's dive into today's interview and see what it's all about. Hey guys, and welcome to the Performance Hub Podcast. So today we've got an amazing guest. It is Luke Leaman from the Muscle Nerds. Luke has been in the industry for a long time now and has amassed an incredible amount of knowledge about health, well-being, strength training, fitness, everything that we kind of try to address, every area that we try and help people with. He really is, I would say, an expert. I came in contact with Luke through the Muscle Nerds courses that they run, and attended the foundations course, and was absolutely blown away by the level of detail and the level of information that they provided over the 3 days about everything that we do with our clients, from ensuring that we maintain their health and the impact of everything that we do on a kind of down to a cellular level. Every type of exercise that we use with them, every diet intervention, every stress management strategy, like how is this impacting on our physical health? When we talk about managing stress and it's going to be good for you and it'll bring your blood pressure down, well, let's go into that and let's really dig into that and what is actually happening on a cellular level. And this stuff it blew my mind. Really, I'm definitely going to be going back onto that course and taking Theo with me, because it's such an incredible course, and I feel like I could do it 5 times over and still come away with new information every time I do the course. So I wanted to bring Luke on to the podcast for you guys, because he is a literal mine of information about all things to do with the personal training and strength training and strength and conditioning, eating well, losing weight, everything that we do with people. He is going to give you some brilliant insights, and I can't wait to go through some of this stuff with him. Like I said, I could sit here and waffle about it all day, because I think he's such a great guy, and he's had such a positive influence on my career. So let's really dig into the interview, and I've got a list of questions from you guys that I'm going to ask him, as well as the stuff that I want to speak to him about. Welcome, Luke. Thanks for joining us on the Performance Hub podcast. Really, in the words of Bernardo Faria, it's a huge honor to have you here. That's a jiu-jitsu joke, by the way, for people listening. So look, I first came kind of in contact with you through the Muscle Nerds foundation course that I attended, and was blown away by the kind of level of content and information that you provided around health and well-being and fitness and getting stronger, and how basically to help all our clients with that stuff and just not fuck them up. Which maybe a lot of people are doing, or a certain amount of people are doing. Hopefully it's getting better. But how did you kind of get to that point? Do you want to tell us a bit about your kind of background, how you arrived at where you are today with the Muscle Nerds?
Yeah, I guess, just in a kind of Reader's Digest version, I've been lifting weights and being in sports since I was a little kid. So I started lifting weights when I was around 8 years old, right? So I'm originally from Texas now. I live in Australia. And if you know anything about Texas and high school football, I was the true Friday Night Lights, where the entire city shuts down and everyone's at the football game. So we start basically getting ready for that when we were little kids. And so I wanted to be a step ahead. So I started learning how to lift weights. My start was seeing Arnold Schwarzenegger in Conan the Barbarian. And I saw Conan and I was like, that is what a man's supposed to look like, right? And then I looked at my father, was a very small man. He was about 5'7", and he's not a big jack guy. And I'm looking at my dad going, well, I'm never going to look like Conan. But then I looked at my mom, and my mom's of like German Austrian heritage, and she's really tall, and I'm the runt of that side of the family. And I went, okay, so if I lift weights and play my cards right, I might actually be able to do that. And so I started lifting weights basically to put on size for football and for martial arts and things. And back then we didn't, this is back in the 80s, we didn't have a lot of access to information like we have now. So I just started the standard, push-ups, curls, squats, and running and things like that. And it just kept developing that. And then in about 1992, I got the internet, and that kind of opened everything up to learning about who Charles Poliquin was, and Charles Staley and Paul Chek and all these guys that I've learned from over the years. And yeah, I just kind of went head first into it and started a powerlifting team in my high school. Our powerlifting team dominated pretty much everybody the 4 years that I was in high school. Left high school, decided to try my hand at bodybuilding. Didn't really like it too much. Went back to powerlifting, went back to physique stuff, went into strongman. So I kind of did all these, everything was about strength, right? And at 6'1" and 220 to 250 pounds, depending on how good I'm at my diet and how I'm lifting, I'm never going to be a really great runner. So I just did what I was good at, which was strength and power. And so I got to a point where, I was at the time a fairly accomplished powerlifter, very strong, but I could barely walk up the stairs without being out of breath. And then I went and worked at Poliquin Group for a while, being one of the lead instructors. And at some point I just had this epiphany that, man, maybe we've got things all wrong. Like, strength is just one tool in the box. And I started getting into more of the body weight movement stuff and actually getting my cardiovascular respiratory system into shape. And I started thinking about being more well-rounded. And I think too, like, I'm 42 now, you get to a certain point where maybe you're in your late 30s. Some people go out and they buy a Corvette. They have a midlife crisis. My midlife crisis was getting my blood pressure in check because I had stage 2 hypertension, getting my triglycerides in check. They were sitting at 400 and they should be under 99. Like, I had all of these kind of coming to Jesus talks with myself about what was important for the second half of my life. And for me, it was putting my health first and then putting my performance secondary, which is something I hadn't done up to that point. And so when I left Poliquin Group, started Muscle Nerds, my wife and I decided that everything we do would be on the foundation of health first and performance secondary.
So, you obviously got, I think you said when we were on the course that your squat was over 300 kilos and you got pretty strong, competitive in that respect. But your markers, your BP and, resting heart rate, triglycerides and things like that, your bloods weren't great. Do you think if you went back and did it again and did it with your current kind of approach that prioritizes health and building a good aerobic base and things like this, that you could still get that strong or stronger? Or do you think it was a necessary evil having to kind of train in that way to get there?
Well, anytime, look, whenever you're at the highest level of sport, it's not going to be healthy. But like back then, I mean, that was back when powerlifters did no conditioning. There was no such thing as a sled and a prowler. We thought that conditioning was for marathon runners, and we didn't do barbell curls because that was for girls. And it was all that type of mentality, right? Yeah. And I think, if I could buy a DeLorean and find a flux capacitor and go back in time and have a talking to Jesus talking to myself, I probably would have been an even better powerlifter, and I probably could have been, world-class powerlifter. But, I got to the point where it just wasn't worth having, being in pain and getting winded walking up a flight of stairs. It just became to me like I got to a point where I'm squatting like 318 and I'm deadlifting like, 333 or so. And that I was the strongest person at almost every gym I went to, but I was also not sleeping well. I had sleep apnea. I couldn't walk across a room without being out of breath. I'd be out of breath just sitting there doing nothing. And I think if I could go back in time and reteach myself, you can definitely be incredibly strong, even elite level strength, and still have adequate conditioning for life. And, when we first started Muscle Nerds, no one was really talking about this, but after teaching foundations around the world a few times, we know lots of powerlifters right now who are like some of the top powerlifters in Australia that are now saying, hey, you need to do your aerobic work. You need to keep in an adequate level of conditioning to keep these metrics in check so that you don't die. Because if there's one thing that's really horrible for performance, it's dying. That's definitely going to kill performance, which is a concept. That's a concept I got from Broderick Chavez, who's well known for training powerlifters, and he's also a powerlifter and a biologist. And I think you just have to look at how do I balance this stuff out. If I can get it, the hard part is getting where you need to be. The easy part is the maintenance. So I think if a lot of people will start like really reassessing where they are and saying, okay, yeah, sure, I can squat 300 kilos, but my blood pressure is 180 over 100. I can probably afford to spend 8 weeks getting my blood pressure down without my total going down too much. My total will actually probably go up even higher if I'm more conditioned, because if I'm more conditioned, I recover better and I can train harder and I can train with a lot more volume and I can eat a lot more food.
Yeah. So I got like a list of questions, but we'll get straight into this one, which I was going to do a little bit later. But, I saw or I listened to or watched the round table that you did recently with Dr. Mike T. Nelson and Alex Vader, is it?
Yeah.
And it was interesting. You guys were talking about cardio for lifters or aerobic work for power lifters, weightlifters, things like this. And it's often a hard sell when you're working with someone who's just trying to build max strength, as to taking a bit of time off of that pursuit and building that aerobic base. So that's something that you would look to do is kind of pull someone back from their kind of strength training, if you like, and spend some time just focusing on some of that low and slow, building that aerobic capacity.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems is people always look at it as it's either this or that. Okay, so it's either I'm going to either lift or I'm going to condition. If you decide that you're going to take health into your hands again and you're going to do some aerobic work, that's very low intensity work. It's not really going to screw with your recovery. The thing that you have to manage is, number one, how much time do you have? If I don't have a lot of time, I've got to take care of what's important. The second thing is I have to feed for nutrition. I have to feed for performance, right? So if I'm going to do more work, I'm going to have to feed myself more food, which a lot of people tend to forget that part. The secondary thing is it's all about, dose makes the poison, right? So if someone is still powerlifting or they're a shot putter or if they're whatever it is, whatever strength sport they're in, it doesn't mean that they need to stop doing that work. They just need to de-emphasize it for a little bit of time and emphasize other qualities. And that's kind of the problem is whenever especially if it's a sport where it's dictated around one big quality like maximal strength, people tend to go too far to the extreme on that, and they start forgetting there's other qualities that they need to keep maintained. Whenever you're in something where you're really going for one singular type of quality, you're going to have to sacrifice other qualities, other places, right? It's the same thing with sports performance and getting stronger. You have one sector of the strength conditioning population say, well, you need to get as strong as possible. Being stronger is always better, but that's not actually the case. Like, there is a limit on how strong you need to be for, say, a certain sport like American football or for soccer or for whatever. You need to be just strong enough. If you keep trying to get stronger, stronger, and stronger, then where are you going to fit in things like power and speed training, agility, change of direction? There's a lot of other things that you're avoiding because you're glorifying getting your squat higher.
Overvaluing, I suppose, that max end number.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, if you look at like even like things like West Side style, like what Louis Simmons popularized with what he calls conjugate training, right? If we look at a concurrent training plan, you can still go for max lifts. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But what you probably want to do if you have high blood pressure, high resting heart rate, and your metrics are off a little bit, you might just want to spend 20 minutes working up to a good 1 to 5 rep max, and then maybe do some conditioning off the side of that. Do a couple of accessory movements and add some really easy, steady state aerobic work at aerobic intervals or something else. Don't avoid it because you think that's going to make your total go down or that's going to make you weaker, because that doesn't seem to be the case.
This is interesting because I guess the kind of Eastern style block periodization was traditionally, really popular. I guess maybe you could say that conjugate or the West Side thing is almost, it's got some of that to it, but then obviously you have this undulating nature to it. But that concurrent training became much less popular in kind of the last, 10 or 20 years. But it seems to be coming back now. And I think a chap who I interviewed for the podcast a couple of weeks ago, Chris Myers, sent me an excerpt from a Dan Baker interview. And he was kind of talking about the way maybe MMA is starting to change the way we look at training or strength and conditioning for sports, in terms of, in MMA, we need to use, aerobic fitness, alactic, lactate, all your energy systems are all going to be heavily needed, as well as that max end strength, and they're able to generate and train all those things seemingly concurrently. Maybe we can apply that same kind of methodology to the weight room, and it seems to be building popularity now, just training everything at once and maybe just increasing or decreasing the amount we're focusing on different aspects of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? We've got different categories of what we're trying to build, and what you need to be looking at is, what am I the weakest at? Okay, so if let's look at like strength, let's look at speed and power, let's look at conditioning aerobically, let's look at anaerobic conditioning. So we can section that off as force, we can section off as velocity, we can section that off as aerobic, your aerobic reserve. And then we can section that off, or Vo2 Max, and then we can section that off as lactate threshold. Those 4 things are inherently incredibly important, especially for MMA and fighting arts. You walk into any jiu-jitsu club and you talk to every single person in there, and they're going to say, "Oh, jiu-jitsu is anaerobic. You don't need to be aerobic." Well, I hate to tell you this, but once you exceed 2 minutes of activity, it's massively aerobic at that point.
Yeah.
And this is why you're getting gassed when you're training. If we think about a match is going to be at minimum probably 5 minutes, okay, what happens if you don't have the stamina to go past 2 or 3 minutes? And that's kind of at my last jiu-jitsu tournament. I went into it saying, okay, I'm going to be the strongest, fastest, most well-conditioned fighter, and I'm also going to be the best well-fed, because I'm going to plan appropriately. And I dominated it, not because my technique's great, because it's not. My technique, I'm a pressure player. I don't know a lot of chokes. I'm not good at setting things up. I'm not good at submissions. But what I'm good at is, if I get on top of you, you're screwed, because I can get real fucking heavy and I can wear you down until you make a mistake, and I'll just score points until the time. I'll run the timeout. I'm one of those shady dudes that'll ramp up 21 points on you, and then I'll just lay on your ass until the time goes out, because you're breathing so hard you can't do anything anymore, right?
I love that tactic. I love it.
It is. You've got to play on your strengths, and I know my strength is strength and conditioning and nutrition. My strength is not my technique. So now going forward, when we can start doing jiu-jitsu again, my next thing will be getting better at actual jiu-jitsu instead of just using my my physical abilities to grind people down, right? But that's one thing I see too with a lot of the MMA guys. They're very strong on the mat, but then you take them in the weight room and they're really fucking weak. Like, imagine what would happen if you were actually decently strong in the gym, and how much that would translate onto the mat, especially if we think about strength being the mother quality for power and speed. Well, if you're the type of fighter that's a very proactive fighter, speed and power is to your benefit. You're not going to be able to produce a lot of speed and power without building a base level of strength. And then you're not going to be able to repeat that strength, power, and speed over and over and over if you don't have the conditioning to survive that. So if you got 8 fights in a day, you might have 2 or 3 really good fights, and then you're destroyed if your conditioning and your nutrition isn't up to par. You're going to have a horrible end of the day fights, which is what I observed at the last tournament I went to, where all of these guys were doing massive weight cuts to try to cut down into their category. I actually planned my weight cut 6 months out. And so I cut down for 6 months, and I cut down below where I needed to be. And then I fed up into my tournament, which was a massive benefit for me. You know, and that's kind of what they need to start. That's what they need to start thinking about. Like, the MMA strength conditioning industry is just horrendous. Like, you've got a couple of people that actually know what they're doing, but the majority of it's still really old school. And, you know, they're still standing on Vo2 balls and, you know, throwing around a fucking band instead of just getting very good at the basic foundational lifts, and then throw the silly shit in there once you're decently strong.
So it sounds like your kind of the value in S&C for combat athletes would be building that aerobic base, building that max in strength, and then, you know, where appropriate or where time appropriate, using building some power. And those 3 things probably being where you're going to get the most return for your investment, really.
Yeah, I feel that way. And I mean, that's my competition coach is really about, you know, he's really a very proactive fighter, and kind of his method of how he coaches us to fight is to, at whatever level your competitor is at, you stay just a little bit higher than that. And when you see them fade out, then you just turn it up because they're done. Like, you've ground them into the ground. So if I'm walking into a fight and I'm well conditioned and I can maintain just a little bit more energy than the other person, the minute they start to falter, they're going to start making mistakes, and I'm going to capitalize on that. And then you have to think about.
Sorry, so just to go back to your condition, like looking at someone being well conditioned, what are your markers for being well conditioned? You know, what are you looking at when you sort of get someone in front of you?
Yeah, so we'll do a Vo2 Max assessment initially, because what we want to make sure is that you have a good aerobic reserve, right? And so the 2 things I'm looking at is we might run a modified Cooper's test where we do a 12-minute time trial on a rower, an aerodyne, or whatever, and then we look at your resting heart rate. My metric says I want to see that you have very high maximal heart rate. How high can I push that? And then how low is my resting heart rate? Because if you have high maximal heart rate and low resting heart rate, you're going to have a very large Vo2 max. And the higher your maximal heart rate is, the benefit of that is that you can control your heart rate more efficiently while you're fighting. As your heart rate goes up, you start losing motor skills. And so if you think about what we're doing when we're grappling, for instance, there's a lot of fine and complex motor skill activation going on, and there's a high level of cognitive thinking going on. The higher my heart rate goes, if I don't have good heart rate tolerance, then I start making mistakes. If I make mistakes, I get caught in something, right? So like, for instance, for me, my maximal heart rate's around 203 right now, okay? And I've gotten it up to that point by doing a lot of aerobic training up front to get that really high and to get my resting heart rate down close to 50. That being said, as the percentage of heart rate goes up, I can maintain a much lower percentage of my maximal heart rate than my opponent, which means he's going to make mistakes and I'm not. He's going to gas out first and I'm not, right? So we look at that with our fighters, first and foremost, as far as the conditioning. And we think about, if you think about strength as being the mother of all qualities for like speed and power and for performance, aerobic conditioning is the mother of all qualities when it comes to the conditioning side. The bigger and broader aerobic base I have, the higher that Vo2 max ceiling, the higher I can get my lactate threshold going, which means I can make more energy a lot faster without getting too much of a pump and dropping too much adrenaline and cramping up and things like that when I'm working on something.
So obviously we can bring that resting heart rate down with aerobic training and, you know, predominantly aerobic training. But our max heart rate, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's going to be generally governed by genetics, no? And our age.
Well, that's what we're told, right? And what's typically what in research, what would they use? 220 minus your age, right? Or they'll use like the math. Yeah, they'll use a very ambiguous calculation because it's a lot easier if you have 400 people in a study, it's a lot easier to do 220 minus your age than it is to run 400 stress tests and actually find out where people's VO2 maxes are.
Yeah.
But this is stuff that's easy. If you have a heart rate strap and you've got a smartphone, this is really easy. You just go as hard as you can for as long as you can, and you see how high your heart rate can get. This is all stuff that's trainable. When I first started getting into the conditioning aspect and realizing that I needed to get that up high fast, 220 minus my age was pretty much spot on. But at the time I was only lifting and I was like a sedentary lifter, right? I was sitting at a desk all day and lifting weights 4 or 5 times a week. And resting heart rate was about 188. By the end of training for a 10K run, it was sitting at 203. And then I've actually got the ability to measure serum lactate, and I can hold a very high heart rate while not really producing shit tons of lactate. So that's going to show me that I'm managing intracellular, the intracellular components of ATP breakdown and energy production.
So does that mean that you've actually managed, through aerobic training, you've actually managed to kind of raise your anaerobic threshold a bit?
Yeah, so if I can,
we're told is primarily governed by genetics, and there isn't much legwork or much return in trying to increase that.
Well, yeah, but we're not a slave to our genetics, are we? Now there are going to be some people that are on the extremes, right? So if we look at a traditional bell curve, most people are going to sit in the middle of the bell curve, somewhere in that like 70%. Then you're going to have freaks like Kenyan runners who win all the marathon races, right? If you look at that and some of the other guys who are really good at endurance training, they tend to have naturally a higher VO2 max. They tend to have mechanisms in their bodies that allows them to have a higher VO2 max. But that doesn't mean that you can't improve that, because you can improve that massively. You can improve that massively, and you can massively improve your tolerance for hydrogen ions by raising that lactate ceiling. But the problem is you can't really raise that lactate threshold very high if you don't raise the VO2 max ceiling as well, because you're always going to be capped out at the VO2 max ceiling.
So if you're getting guys coming in, well, we tend to use the Concept 2 test and then use the calculator on the website. And what I find is most of the jiu-jitsu and MMA guys are actually pretty good. Their VO2 max are coming in pretty high. But we can always, I guess, improve their aerobic output, in terms of on the mats, making them fitter, rather than just saying, okay, it's high, let's just not concentrate on that. Yeah,
I think it's going to be a component of how experienced they are. Depends on a sedentary person walks in and starts training jiu-jitsu. They're typically, if they don't do the typical white belt stuff, if they come in and they listen to the experienced guys where they're saying, conserve your energy, don't freak out, those guys are going to make a tremendous amount of hydrogen very quickly, because they have a massive jump. They have a massive dump in adrenaline, because there's nothing that's going to make you more stressed out than somebody sitting on your face and pinning your arms down, right? So, but once you learn how to control that fear of being strangled and that fear of being suffocated and that fear of being held down, you start learning to manage your energy from an output perspective. But then you can also train the mitochondria, and you can train the cardiovascular respiratory system to bring that VO2 max back up. So I think it's really a lot of it's going to be dictated by, where you are in that journey. Are you a beginner? Or are you kind of in the middle? Or are you at the end of it? One thing that I notice with a lot of the guys, because you know how it is, guys come in and they train for 6 months and they're doing really well, and then life happens and they don't train for like 3 months. So they get in pretty decent shape in 6 months, and when they come back 3 months later, it's like they never fucking trained before. They come back and they're completely out of shape again. What I found that is, if you do the cross training and you work on your heart and you work on your vascular system and you work on your mitochondria, it's a lot easier to get in shape really quickly when you come back to it. And it has much less chance of it dropping off.
Definitely. And that's, you touched on kind of the mental aspect of conditioning. And that's definitely something I want to touch on at some point. But that's when I did the Joel Jameson certification, they spoke about that the different components of conditioning, and the mental side of it was super interesting, how we can literally use up physical energy that we can use on physical performance, just kind of worrying and not going into a combat situation in the right mindset. It's definitely something super interesting.
Absolutely, because look, all of these things are going to be dictated by allosteric effectors. So the more stressed I am going into a match or going into a role, the more likely I'm going to gas out really fast, because I'm going to have a huge adrenaline what am I looking for? Dump, which is then going to make me shaky. It's going to screw up my bioenergetics. I'm not going to be able to compete very long. I found that out. And the thing is, I know all this stuff, right? But nothing prepares you for your very first match at a competition. Sure. And I remember I was fighting a guy. It was my first fight ever at a tournament. It was his first fight ever. I walked up. He's probably, we're about the same age. He was a bit more weathered than me. You could tell that he didn't, take care of himself. And I just saw the fear in his eyes when I walked up, because I walked up, I was shredded and jacked, and he's looking at me like, oh my God, I got to fight this guy. And I'm looking at him thinking, fuck, it doesn't really matter how jacked and shredded you are. If this guy's technique's better than mine, he's going to choke me out in 30 seconds. And the minute I got him on the ground, I could tell, like, oh, this is not going to go well for him. He is not ready and not conditioned for this. So kind of the start of the fight, everything was going well for me until about 3.5 minutes in, when I realized I'm holding him too hard and I'm working too hard. And I remember I had his back and I had my hooks in, and I'm reaching across trying to grab his lapel, and I just realized I can't flex or extend my arm, and my hands don't work anymore. So
that dream.
Yeah, and I got real shaky, and I'm like, I don't understand. Like, my brain is telling my arm to go across his neck, and I can't actually get my arm to go there, and my elbow started to seize up. Then my adductors started to seize up, and I went, okay, this is what my coach was talking about when he says I need to relax, because that mental side, your brain's going to control everything in the peripheral system, and if your brain feels like it's in a threatened state, especially in combat, it's going to overreact, and it's going to then push out too much adrenaline and things, which is going to exhaust you much faster and make you cramp a lot faster.
Okay, so much stuff that you've kind of mentioned, and there are a few things that I want to go back to and dig into. You mentioned you sort of briefly just mentioned about the impacts, about aerobic training on our mitochondria. And this is something that we're hearing a lot more about lately, is, mitochondria being, the powerhouse of the cell and being so important for health and fitness. Do you want to just touch on that a little bit? Because I know that was something that we spoke about a lot in the course, and the impact of a good training regime on our mitochondria and how that can benefit our health.
Yeah, so this is where you're making the majority of your energy, right? Through the mitochondria. So if I have someone who is chronically stressed out over time, if their metabolic flexibility is very low, we get to a point where the mitochondria is not working as effectively as it should. We're not oxidizing things as effectively as we should. Once you stop oxidizing things effectively, and if you think about that word oxidizing, what element on the periodic table do you need to oxidize things? You need oxygen. So that in and of itself should be a case of, hey, maybe I do want to do some aerobics, because that's the one thing that gets more oxygen into my body and allows me to oxidize better. The better my mitochondria work, and the more mitochondria I have up to a point, the more energy I can make faster and the more endurance I have. As well as the more food I can eat, because I can churn through that much better. And then when you think about the majority of your fighters that you're in contact with, how do they eat?
Yeah, it varies, but some of them not great, some of them, but often they're, probably in a calorie deficit more often than not, I'd say.
Oh, and they're in a massive calorie deficit. I know guys that compete at the top levels, that they're lucky to eat 1,200 to 1,800 calories a day. And it just blows my mind, because I remember getting ready for my first tournament, I was eating 5,000 to 6,000 calories a day because I was dropping weight too quickly. And so then I look at my competition coach and I'm going, how are you surviving on 1,800 calories a day? And then I realized, because I was training him at the time as well, Well, no wonder you're getting gassed out. No wonder you have all these injuries that won't heal. You're not feeding yourself enough to make the stuff heal. So the first thing is, if we work on that mitochondria. Yeah, sorry, the dog just walked in.
That's all right.
So,
he's part of the team, so
if we're working on the mitochondria initially, we're going to have a lot more energy to perform and keep that performance higher over time, because that's really the key. First, you have to perform, but then you have to keep that performance high over 5 minutes. Or what if you're in a super fight and it's 20 minute submission only fight? Like, what happens if it gets past 10 minutes and you don't have the ability to manage the next 10 minutes? You're pretty screwed, So what we like to do is work on that aerobic base first, get the mitochondria functioning much better initially. Then to me, you now deserve to do the higher level stuff. Now, if you want to do HIIT training and you want to do all that, that's great. You can do all that, but you can't. A lot of people will start with the intense stuff before they've laid the foundation of the easy stuff first, right? And it sounds counterintuitive to take a step back and able to go forward, but there's also the saying in judo, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Sometimes you have to slow things down, right, before you can make them fast. And the same thing with weight training as well. Why do we teach people to go with slow tempo weight training initially? It's to get very good at the exercise before you speed the exercise up. And so the same thing goes with the conditioning too. I need to lay down the machinery that's going to allow me to have the endurance and the recovery capacity to perform at a high level, which means that in a lot of cases, I want to make sure that anaerobic and aerobic side of my metabolism is balanced out. Okay. So you'll see a lot of the fighters are very anaerobically conditioned. They're just not very aerobically conditioned, right?
So we always, we've been told by Men's Health and whoever else, maybe CrossFit, I don't know, for a long time that like kind of HIIT training will be enough, and that will get us our aerobic gains, or you can get better aerobic kind of gains from HIIT training than steady state. But I think now we're starting to kind of dispel that myth. Is that right? Or maybe I've got that wrong.
No, one thing is we have to define what we're talking about with HIIT training, right? So again, we split this into two different categories. You have researchers that will look at high intensity interval training as a factor of how high you can keep your heart rate for a certain amount of time. But then you'll have another side of the researchers that dictate HIIT as power output. And I tend to look at it as more of power output. How high can I have my power output? How long can I maintain that power? For me, that's going to be more important when we're talking about sports, is that I can maintain power and repeat that power over and over and over across however many minutes I have to compete at.
So things like alactic intervals and things like that.
What's that?
So things like alactic intervals, lactic power intervals, things like this.
Yeah, and like even things like alactic intervals, to me, if it's alactic with complete rest, I don't see a lot of usability for that in combat sports. Right. There's nothing you're really going to do that's going to last 10 seconds that you need to recover from, right? You're probably looking more towards building an aerobic base and building enough glycolytic base so that you can maintain a high level of power and endurance by using both fat and carbohydrate equally at the same time.
Okay. So, but just to go back to the question, you're saying that we need to lay that foundation with like LISS, essentially low intensity, steady state cardio. Could it be done with interval training, or is it really that we need to focus on that low intensity stuff?
Actually, yeah, that was one of the questions you had, like what's the usability of LISS? There's a reason why over the last however many 100 years that we've been having combat sports that people do road work. Like, why do boxers do road work? If you go to Thailand and you go and you do Muay Thai, you're going to be running a lot. Okay. And there's a good reason for that. They understand the value of that. Now, I do think that can be taken to an extreme. Like, we're not trying to create marathon runners, but being able to go out and do a 5K and maybe a couple of 5K intervals and perform that really at a high level is probably going to be beneficial for you. But again, whenever we talk about cardio, there's two things people think about. They either think about weight loss or they think about running a marathon. They think about like the two most extreme things you can think of. I'm thinking about adaptation, right? I'm thinking about recovery. I'm thinking about better sleep. I'm thinking about the ability to eat more food, the ability to maintain power output for a long time. That's the stuff I'm thinking about. And it doesn't take a long time to build that aerobic base, depending on where you start, right? If you start in your Vo2 Max, if you put somebody in a Concept 2 and they're at a 24, yeah, it's going to take them a while to get that up. But for most people, I see massive improvements in just 6 to 8 weeks of dedicated Vo2 Max training. If you just get that out of the way, the drop off from that is very, very low. You just get that out of the way and then kind of put that on maintenance. And you can maintain a lot of that, just doing easy flow rolls and things like that. If you go in on a, open mat and just find somebody who wants to do easy flow rolling for 20 or 30 minutes, very easy to maintain that cardiovascular adaptation. And then you can focus on other things. Like if you want to throw in, more HIIT type training, that's good too. Now, the secondary thing with this is when we look at HIIT training, we have to dictate what we're looking for. Are you looking for global cardiovascular respiratory adaptations, or are you looking at localized conditioning, right? So global conditioning is Vo2 Max. Localized is, do I have enough enzymes and do I have the machinery in my peripheral system to then take advantage of that extra oxygen? Like doing things like rowing and running and the airdyne and the ski erg and that type of thing will build a lot of good global conditioning. If I'm going to turn that into localized conditioning, which I should when I move it into a more specific phase, now since you've done Joel Jamieson's things, this is where we're looking at things like HRIs and HICTs and things like that to then build the machinery localized in my limbs to then be able to take advantage of that and be able to oxidize better now that I can get that oxygen in. So if you think about it, the first thing is you have to get the oxygen into the body. Then you have to get the machinery in the peripheral system to be able to utilize that oxygen as well. So if I can't get the oxygen in, it doesn't matter how good I am locally. I still have to support that with my lungs and with my heart and with my vascular system. So it makes sense to go ahead and take care of that first, then get really specific on, heavy sled pushes and pulls and strongman type work. And then working more on that really high intensity interval training side of it. Now that I can take advantage of EPOC because I can get oxygen in now.
Yeah, and I suppose if, again, taking that to the next level, if you can do that with specific movements, that SPP stuff in like your drilling or, specific MMA or jiu-jitsu related movements going to be kind of even more, efficient and, preparing you for the task at hand.
Yeah, I mean, if you go like just imagine, if you go to a fight specific class where you're getting ready for a tournament, you're going to do things like Shark Tank. Like you're going to be in there, you're going to be going hard, balls to the wall. If you have a good level of aerobic foundation, it's not going to be as hard for you as if you didn't, right? So it's only going to be a benefit, right? And you see that, right? You go to a competition class, and you can see the guys who it's their first class and they don't know what to expect. And then they quickly realize this isn't a normal class. And you're basically rolling hard, like you're basically fighting for your life for 60 to 90 minutes. And they find out really quickly after 10 to 15 minutes of this, oh shit, I need to get in shape.
It's the stress tester. I know my heart rate always goes up. If the coach says, well, it's Shark Tanks today, you're like, fuck. I wish I had that pizza for lunch. Okay, you touched on like your jiu-jitsu coach and kind of the example you gave around probably globally amongst MMA fighters, but actually let's even look out at the weight loss population and how people tend to just survive in a calorie deficit. So if we switch our focus to a weight loss scenario, it could be a fighter or it could just be someone trying to lose weight. Like in my practice, I often see people coming in and it seems as if when we look at their diet that they've been existing for a long time in a calorie deficit, probably underneath their, even without calculating their calorie need, you can see that they're probably in a calorie deficit. And when you do calculate it, certainly backs that up. But they're potentially not losing weight and potentially, just they say that they're fine, but objectively you could look at it and think they're probably not fine. Can you just dig into some of that about why, being in a calorie deficit long periods of time maybe isn't the best thing for people?
Yeah, so I thought about that a lot, that question that you had sent me. And there's a few different scenarios that you see. You have people that, you have one, like we'll go through a few different clients. Client A has no idea about food and calories. They think they do because maybe they watch something on Oprah or whatever. I don't know. But they don't realize how many calories are actually in the food they're eating, and they don't realize they're eating twice the amount of calories than they're supposed to be eating. You get that client too. Yeah. That client's very easy to manage. You teach them about food, you get them tracking for a small amount of time so that they can eyeball their food, and then they realize, shit, I'm actually eating 400 calories more than I thought, or in some cases double what they thought they were eating. Then you have on the extreme other side of that, you have people that have been in a very severe deficit for a long time. We see this a lot in the physique industry where I know girls that eat 700 to 900 calories a day and they train like 24 hours a week, right? It's like, how are you even surviving on that? And that's all they're doing. They're surviving. They're not actually, they're losing their periods, their hair's falling out. Their fingernails are getting brittle and breaking off. Like they're barely getting through the day. They've got all these issues going on. And so in that case, a lot of those people need to understand, like, being in a long-term caloric deficit like that is eventually going to lead to something called REDS, which is relative energy deficiency syndrome, where if I don't have enough calories to support everything my body needs biologically, it's going to get rid of the things that it doesn't actually need to survive. Like, what do you need to survive? My brain, my heart, my kidneys, my liver, like all those vital organs still need to be able to operate. Your ovaries don't need to operate well. Your balls don't need to operate well, right? Like, yeah. So like, I like to talk about it like a car, right? If you're driving your car and you're running out of gas and you're 5 kilometers away from the nearest petrol station, and it's hot outside. It's 40 degrees Celsius outside. What's the first thing you're going to turn off to try to save gas so you don't have to push your car?
Maybe the aircon.
You can turn off the aircon. You're going to roll the windows down and suffer. You're probably going to turn the radio off too. Like, you're going to turn off anything that you don't need because you don't want to have to push that car the rest of the way. So that's kind of what your body does as well. If it's running low on energy, it's just going to turn off the air conditioner. It's going to turn off the radio. It's going to turn off anything it doesn't need so it can actually make it to the next meal. So you can get into situations where people have been chronically dieting for a long time, or they're not eating enough for the activity that they're doing. And so they get this metabolic maladaptation where things start to slow down, or their body just eliminates things for a small period of time, kind of puts them in hibernation until you actually make that deficit back up. And you see it a lot, like people when January comes around, what's everybody do? I'm going to go to the gym. This is my year. 20 years in a row, 20th time. This is my year to get in shape and lose all this flab. They jump into the gym and they start thrashing themselves, and they go on like a 12 to 1500 calorie diet. And they don't realize that calories in, calories out model, their calories out is so high that they really, when you do the math, they don't have enough energy coming in to support basic life systems. So their body starts shutting things down in order to just get by, right? So in a lot of cases, those chronic dieters need to massively increase their calories, at least close to maintenance. So typically what we'll do is, when we have somebody that's been chronically dieting like that, we'll take them to almost maintenance less, maybe 10% calories. And that's usually a lot more, 800, 900, sometimes 1200 calories more than they've been eating. Now, all of a sudden, thermogenesis gets upregulated. They're not freezing cold all the time. All of a sudden, they get their period back. They can get a solid boner, and now they want to have sex. So that's great. They're sleeping better. Their guts aren't dysfunctional. But it's a really hard sell to someone who's been chronically dieting that, listen, you're going to have to eat more for a small amount of time, and you're probably going to have to gain a little weight initially before we can start dieting again, right? I don't have a problem with long-term dieting or long continuous dieting as long as the deficit is only small enough to chip away at body fat, right? But that's not what people do. People they'll write a diet and they'll be eating, 60% of what they need to be eating. And then they do that for months and months and months and months, whereas they might only need to just pull 15% of their calories out, and they could do that for a long period of time. If they're going to pull a lot of calories out, then it's probably going to be beneficial to throw in some refeeds, right? And so one of the tools we'll use for that is basically a thermometer. We'll have them track their afternoon temperature. And if that's really low, then we'll overfeed them until we get their temperature higher, and then we'll start a deficit. If they're cruising along and we see a trend in their body temperature going down, it's time for a refeed or it's time for a diet break.
What would you say is a significant drop in body temperature?
So typically what we see girls in the high 34s, low 35s. And that's when, and then it's the typical symptoms, like I'm cold all the time, cold hands and feet. They usually have super low blood pressure. They have no energy to do anything. They're just surviving on sheer willpower. That's something we see. What we like to do is let's try to get you around, 36.4 to 36.8. And then we'll start chipping some calories away. But if we see that temperature starts to tank, we're going to need to do a diet break or a refeed.
Wow. Yeah. Super. I like that. I've not heard of that actually, using like those metrics to kind of indicate when we do a refeed. I know a lot of people might do every 3 or 4 weeks or 8 weeks or something like that, just put in a refeed because they know that they've been in a kind of deficit for a while. But having a metric there to kind of indicate when your body is actually starting to lose some of that functions, it's great, because we've got the data. Data's so important, isn't it?
It makes more sense to do it that way, right? So it makes more sense to not use ambiguous time periods because everybody's totally different, right? When I was teaching at Polican Group, our thing was deload your workout every third workout if you're doing heavy strength work. Yeah. But not everybody needs that, right? If I can use a metric like resting heart rate and HRV, if I have somebody in their third week and resting heart rate is starting to go up and their HRV is starting to tank, I already know they're overreaching. It's time for a deload at that point, or it's time to switch emphasis on what they're training. Same thing with the thermometer. The only problem is there's not a lot of data. Like if you talk to people who are evidence-based, they're going to go, oh, well, there's not a lot of literature out there with the thermometer stuff, but like we use it with a lot of success. That's something that, and you've probably heard, I don't know when you did foundations, but it's kind of when we started doing our level 2 foundation, we started talking about thyroid and thermogenesis stuff. That was kind of a point of watch people's temperature. If it starts to drop and they're feeling cold, then they probably don't have enough energy intake to ramp up thermogenesis. We probably want to take care of that because that's going to be super important. And that's a good indicator that you've pushed it too far.
Yeah, super interesting. I think that's a bit of a game changer for a lot of people who are probably trying to lose weight and maybe struggling to lose weight. They've been in a calorie deficit for a long time. Things have kind of slowed down. And it's like, where do you go from that? You cut your calories down from 2,000 to 1,500 to maybe 1,000. And you're saying, well, I can't cut it down anymore. And you see people, with the best of intentions, giving this advice that, look, your weight loss is stalled. It's time to pull your calories down because calorie deficit is the most important thing. And it's like, well, how far do what point do you stop doing that?
I mean, do you just keep pulling it down to your 0 calories and you're like doing a 40-day Jesus fast? I don't know. Or do you eat, celery so it's like negative calories or whatever people say, right? It's just at some point you got to look at it and say, I feel horrible. I'm not losing weight. Something's not working. Maybe I try doing the opposite of what I'm doing. Maybe I go back to maintenance for a period of time, see if I feel better. Maybe I cut the training down a little bit or try a different type of training, and see if things work out. The only problem is that for a lot of people, that initial weight gain kind of screws with them. And, when people are desperate, the thinking portion of their brain kind of turns off and they start thinking very limbically and very emotionally. So if I have someone who's been dieting and, they're not seeing a lot of success, if I say, hey, Karen, look, we're going to pump your calories up like 800, you are going to gain a small amount of weight. This is not fat. It's most likely just water, glycogen, and fecal matter. That's all it is. Like that, you take a good solid poo, it'll come right off. You get in a really hot bath and sweat it off like an MMA athlete, it'll come right back off. But the minute they get on the scale, one of the issues is their identity surrounds that scale, right? So the minute they get on the scale and it goes up, their feeling of self-worth goes down, and they see that as a negative, and then they starve themselves the next day. Okay, so in a lot of cases, it takes a lot of time coaching and saying, look, you gaining this weight is okay. That does not define you. And if you want to get better, you're going to have to gain a little weight initially. And what's crazy is the most I typically see people gain, I don't think I've ever had a girl gain more than about 3 kilos in weight with the refeeding, even doubling their calories. Because once you start adding those calories back, all those systems that have been dormant now turn on. Their body heat goes up. They burn more calories when they train. They're sleeping better. Like the body has a really good, it's very efficient at moving itself up and down depending on what you're doing to it. So it's very good at keeping you alive when you're doing dumb shit to it.
Yeah,
it's just the psychological aspect of convincing them that it has to get a little bit worse before it gets better, because you're at 900 calories. I'm not willing to take you to 600 calories, and I'm not willing to add, 5 more training sessions, because that's not going to provide a long-term solution.
And it's the whole experience is just really having an impact on the nervous system as well, I imagine. That more and more training, less and less food. And this is one of the things that really, which struck a chord with me when I did the foundations course, was how, or the impact of the nervous system, and, being in that kind of stress response for long periods of time, the impact, again, that is having on our health, on a broad spectrum of different areas of our health, is so powerful. And there are things that we just wouldn't expect. There are certain aspects that, that increased cortisol that we just wouldn't expect. And I don't know if you want to dig into some of that stuff, because I know it's a big thing that we're looking at nowadays in the industry.
Yeah, and the thing is, I hate saying cortisol, because if you say that, then it kind of demonizes cortisol. And cortisol, what it's doing is it's actually protecting you. It's actually keeping you alive because of what you're doing to yourself. So in a lot of cases, probably the main thing that's really screwing people up, if we want to blame something, it's probably going to be adrenaline. Okay, because adrenaline, if you think about listening to that talk that I had with Alex Faeda and with Mike T. Nelson. Mike T. Nelson said something very, very important. Insulin is kind of like a master switch for your metabolism. Okay. Well, the real opponent of insulin is adrenaline. Okay. So if we think about what they do, insulin tells things to basically be anabolic. It tells you to take little things and build big things out of them. So like taking sugar and turning it into stored glycogen, right? Taking fat out of the bloodstream and putting it in adipocytes, where it's in a much safer area in a fat cell than it is in your bloodstream, right? So at this point, insulin's doing a very good job of protecting you. If you get more and more stressed out and you have an adrenaline load, adrenaline does the opposite. It tells things to break down. Because if your brain thinks that you're being threatened, you're wanting a lot of energy to be pushed out into the bloodstream and also to be broken down into the cell. So you get at this point when people are very stressed out that they're breaking things down faster than they can build them back up. Okay, so if I'm breaking down glycogen really quickly to make glucose and I'm shoving tons of glucose into the cell, it's going to overwhelm the mitochondria. If the mitochondria gets overwhelmed, it's going to shut down the enzymes that's going to allow things to go into the mitochondria. Then it's going to shut the cell down, so you become insulin resistant. And you can become insulin resistant, and then later you can become fatty acid resistant. Now you take somebody to do bloods, and they have high triglycerides, high cholesterol, or high LDL, low HDL, high levels of inflammation, high blood sugar. This is all basically a cell danger response, where you probably have too much energy trying to be pushed into the cell because you're too stressed out. So, one of the things that I've been thinking about lately when I look into the biochemistry of it, is it really a caloric toxicity that's causing the issues, or is it something deeper? And one of those main regulators is going to be something called acetyl-CoA that's in your mitochondria. When it gets to a level of high, it's going to shut the mitochondria down until it's going to say, I'm overwhelmed. I don't need any more of these substrates. So that's what's going to shut the cell down to stop accepting things. Well, if it shuts that down, then things like glucose and fatty acids are going to get higher in the bloodstream, which can create a level of glucotoxicity and lipotoxicity. Well, where's a really good garbage dump for those things? Fat cells. So we use fat cells as kind of a garbage disposal for excessive things like environmental toxins or like fuel substrates that can't be used initially.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose the outcome of that is things like heading towards type 2 diabetes and.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But this goes back, if we circle around, of why it's so important to get a good level of aerobic fitness and get your Vo2 Max up. It's especially helpful for people who are getting into that metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes type of, if they're moving down the continuum towards that. If I can get someone to do the work and make more mitochondria, it's like they say, many hands make light work. If I have more mitochondria, then I can disperse that excessive amount of fuel to more workers, and I can create more energy out of that.
So people, I mean, just looking at that little, because we will see that a fair bit, people coming in who are kind of flirting with type 2 diabetes, kind of on that kind of line of not quite there, but the blood sugar readings are coming in higher than they should be, pre and postprandial, maybe waking. You're saying potentially that, like, if we can, generally the advice that we're getting from the NHS is go and lose weight. Go and lose weight as being the primary kind of, thing that's going to have a positive impact and bring the blood sugars down. If you lose weight, get into a calorie deficit, that's going to be enough. And certainly sometimes we're seeing that. Other times, not necessarily seeing that being enough. And so you're saying potentially this idea of building like an aerobic base is going to be very impactful.
It's going to impact it massively. Like, the NHS isn't wrong. Like, one of the best things you can do for your health if you are overweight is to lose body fat. Like, that's one of the best things you can do, right? But what are you gonna tell the really skinny diabetic about that? When you have a guy who's skinny and he's type 2 diabetic, what the fuck is he gonna lose? He doesn't have any weight to lose. He's got to build muscle and he's got to build mitochondria, right? So what you typically see is everything is going to bottleneck out at certain levels of the biochemistry, and everything happens in about the same way, but it can happen for different reasons. I can be eating a lot of exogenous food that can be gumming those things up, or I could be in a massive caloric deficit. My body tanks down my metabolism, so now that alters the calories in, calories out, just the same as not doing anything and overeating will. So it's two different scenarios, but realistically, a lot of the same thing happening at the cellular level.
And then if we couple kind of extra stressors on top of that, shifting people more into that sympathetic nervous system, we might be getting that impact of adrenaline on the whole process as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The lower your HRV is, the more prone you're going to be for having high amounts of adrenaline. The more prone you are to be reactive to things. The more prone you are to anxiety and stress, which is then going to become like a never-ending cycle of self-induced stress. That's kind of one of the things, you've got to break out of that. And to break out of that, sometimes we have to do the things that we don't like to do, especially for men. Like, to tell a guy he needs to do a little bit more aerobic conditioning and journal and meditate and maybe see a counselor, he's going to be like, nah, fuck off. I'm just going to go lift more weights and run hill intervals and shit like that. And that will work for a period of time, but it doesn't always work. It's not always a long-lasting solution. And it's the same thing on the side of the women. Whenever a woman comes in, they're typically, and I'm saying all this in a very generalized manner. Most guys that come in are going to be hypertense, and most girls are going to be hypotense. And a lot of it has to do with what they've done before they've come to see you. Whenever most men want to change the way their physique looks, what modality do they usually choose?
Piling food in and lifting weights.
That's it, right? Exactly right. So here's the thing. I'm piling food. Hypertrophy work and overeating is inherently insulin resistance promoting, and it's inherently inflammatory promoting. And that's not a bad thing if it's balanced out. But most guys will go on a 9-month bulk to try to put weight on, and they don't realize maybe it's wintertime and you're wearing a lot of heavy clothing and you're not really looking at yourself naked, and you look really good in clothes, and then you spring hits and you're going to start your summer shred, and you kind of take an assessment of yourself in the mirror and you go, oh my God, I took that bulk a little too far. So then what do they end up doing? They super diet and they go the opposite direction. So most of the guys that we see, they probably need to do more conditioning initially and a little bit less weight training. Not no weight training, but a little bit less emphasis on that and a little bit more emphasis on the conditioning side. Most women probably need to do a little less conditioning and a little bit more actual weight training. Because you get a girl that comes in and again, for anybody listening to this, I know I'm not trying to be misogynistic. I'm just speaking from experience. Most girls will come in and you'll say, okay, look, you're borderline very hypotense. You tell me whenever you stand up, you're getting postural hypotension. You're seeing spots and you're getting really, you're starting to feel faint. You have cold hands and feet. What we're going to work on is we're probably going to work on a lot of strength training initially and not as much conditioning. And then it's almost always they go, oh, I do strength training. And you go, oh, cool. What do you do? They go, oh, I do body pump. You're like, no. That's not what I mean is like uncomfortable lifting where you actually strain and you feel like you're going to poop out your spleen. Like that's what I'm talking about. Because that's what's going to raise your blood pressure back up. Yeah. And for the guys, it's like, hey man, your blood pressure is really high. You got stage 2 hypertension. I need to get that down. You're not going to be able to lift that away. We're probably going to have to do some just standard aerobic interval training or Tabatas or whatever you steady state cardio lifts, whatever. You might need to do that for a little bit of time. And then the guy looks at you and goes, oh no, I'm going to lose all my gains. I'm like, well, if you have a heart attack, you're going to lose your gains anyways. If you get diabetic, you're going to lose them anyways. So you might as well spend a good 6 to 8 weeks getting in shape, and then we can reassess and start working on your strength and hypertrophy at that point.
So yeah, super interesting. And that's exactly it. That is a lot of the time what you see, isn't it? It's one needing to go one way and men maybe needing to be pulled back a little bit. I want to touch on the nervous system, but I've got some questions from people that kind of submitted some questions. And I think we'll kind of touch on some of the things within those questions that the nervous system's having an impact on that we might not actually understand, or we might not realize that our kind of unmanaged nervous system is having an impact on. This is one that I'll ask you the question and then you can kind of or let us know about it. But
sure.
Someone's messaged in and kind of said that they have been told that they've got a gluten intolerance, so a food intolerance. But they've done their own research, and there's a bit of a split. Some people are saying gluten is this kind of toxic substance, different farming techniques nowadays causing this, intolerance or widespread intolerance to gluten. Other people, so not necessarily celiac, but just intolerance. Other people are saying this doesn't exist. This is bullshit. But the person is saying that they've had a positive response in terms of cutting gluten out of their diet. That they don't, but they're not sure. They kind of think, well, maybe gluten isn't the problem, but I am seeing a positive response in terms of cutting gluten out of my diet. Do you have any thoughts about what might be causing that reaction to gluten and why that might be occurring?
Well, okay, so you can get intolerant to pretty much almost anything food-wise, right? Whether that's intolerance to dairy or whether it's intolerance to a certain vegetable or whatever. So when you're under an extreme amount of chronic stress or stress for a long time, we realize that the master controller for this is your hypothalamus. So if you think this hypothalamus is a little gland in your brain, and it's kind of like looking around at the rest of everybody else, and it's saying, okay, here, I go back. I'll teach it the way I usually do, because I think about it as a business. Think about the hypothalamus as like the CEO of a company, right? So what does the CEO do? He looks at financial reports and predictions, and he looks at history, and he looks at all this stuff, and he makes decisions on what everybody else needs to be doing. Mm-hmm. So then if he's looking around and he's seeing that, you're stressed out and you have all these issues going on, he's going to then talk to other glands in the body. Like one of the main ones is the pituitary gland. And that you think about him, he's kind of like the general manager of the company. So he's getting advice from the CEO. He's then going to go tell all the other departments what they need to do. Okay, so then the pituitary will talk to the adrenals and the thyroid and the testes and all these other areas, and they'll tell the workers what to do, and the workers are all your little hormones and that type of thing. So depending on what's been going on, things like trauma, early childhood trauma, adult trauma, chronic stress, not sleeping enough, chronically dieting, yo-yo dieting, overeating, all these things are stressors. Training's a stressor, like everything is a stressor. Your brain is going to mount a response to that through a chemical signal, through adrenal output of things like cortisol. And it's going to also have a nervous system component as well. Here's the thing. If I'm bathing in stress for a long time, the nervous system can then accelerate intestinal permeability by increasing activation of mast cells and histamine, which basically, for lack of a better way of saying it, punches holes in your intestines and allows for things to get into circulation that aren't supposed to be there.
So
high levels of cortisol.
Leaky gut, is that leaky gut syndrome, what people have referred to?
Yeah, and depending on who you talk to, if you say leaky gut syndrome, they'll lose their minds. To me, it's all a matter of semantics. Like leaky gut, intestinal permeability, whatever. That basically your things are getting into circulation that aren't supposed to be there. Stress increases something called zonulin, which then also creates leakier cells and that type of thing. So you start getting antigens or food particles that aren't digested totally in the body. You start bacteria, viruses, all sorts of stuff that can get into circulation. And then you mount an immune system response, which increases inflammation. And then the immune system starts to attack those foods. So if it's somebody that maybe they've lived off of gluten for a long period of time and they've gone through some traumatic things and not sleeping a lot, or maybe they were building their career and they basically ate a croissant for breakfast and a ham sandwich for lunch and a lasagna baked for dinner, and they've been over consuming gluten for a long time while they're under stress, there's a good chance that they could have an immune modulated inflammatory response towards that food. So then every time they get a reaction. So yeah, that there can be that, there's a lot of things about gluten that nobody knows about yet. We don't know that much about the body anyways. People try to talk like we know what the hell the body's doing. Nobody knows shit, right? It's modern medicine has not been around that long, and we're still finding things out all the time and testing and retesting. But if you get locked into that type of brain trauma, stress, chronic stress, whatever, and then you start getting an immune system response, if you pull gluten out, you're probably going to feel a bit better. If you put it back in, you're probably going to feel a bit worse. So in that case, if you feel better without the gluten, then just avoid gluten for a while, say like 6 to 8 weeks. Try to avoid it as much as you can, and then try eating it again. And if you don't get a response to it, then genetically, you probably don't have a problem. If you've been tested, if you're not celiac, if you don't have an IBD, IBS, whatever, gluten's probably not going to be a problem. But people need to understand that anytime you overeat anything while you're under an enormous amount of stress, you are probably going to get intolerant to that, which is why people should probably try a lot of stress management, and B, good food variety.
Okay. So if someone does get to that point, potentially pulling that out of the diet and starting to address some of those kind of chronic stressors, and then maybe thinking about reintroducing it at a later date when stress is more manageable, or building those tools to manage stress, and potentially there could be some reintroduction without the symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you do a lot of reading into it, nobody knows, is it gluten that's the problem, or is it wheat that's the problem? Is corn the problem? There's all these things that can be causing inflammation. If you're overeating them, especially if your body can't recover from that, then that can cause a problem. Hell, training causes intestinal permeability. If you train in the heat, you become temporarily permeable in the intestines.
Really?
Especially if you're training at a high Vo2 Max, like what you would be doing if you're rolling a lot and competing and doing jiu-jitsu, or if you're an endurance athlete, or if it's hot outside, if like in Brisbane here, it's hot most of the year, and if you're training out in my shed and it's 38 degrees outside and 80% humidity, you are creating a situation where as your core body temperature goes up, it does create a level of intestinal permeability. And so you have to keep that in mind, right? So if I'm eating gluten breakfast, lunch, and dinner, if I'm eating dairy and I have a dairy issue, if I'm also training in the heat, if I'm not getting enough sleep, these are all contributing factors that would then quite possibly create an environment where you could become intolerant to a certain food. the thing to do is do an elimination diet for a while and then try to add it back in. If you get another reaction, then guess what? Gluten's probably not for you. But I personally could not, I don't have any issues with gluten. My issues typically with dairy. When I get stressed out, I get dairy issues. But man, if I had to go the rest of my life without dairy or gluten, man, life's not worth living. Shit. But it's just
a lot of food groups there, isn't it? You know?
Yeah, I mean, no pizza, no, Greek yogurt and all this shit. Yeah, like I feel sorry for a lot of my friends and a lot of my colleagues that do actually have real issues. Like one of my trainers, Shane, he's celiac. Like he can't have it. Like, and I'm just looking at that like, man, I wish there was something I could do to snap my finger and fix that so that he could have foods that he doesn't, he can't have. His partner does not have celiac, but every time she adds in gluten, it jacks her up. My wife, Zoe, every time she eats gluten, it jacks her up, right? So if, even if you're tested and you're shown that it's not an issue, it could still potentially be an issue. And if it's bothering you that bad, then just avoid it.
Well, we went on a holiday to Sicily for 2 weeks, and the amount of cannolis and ice cream and pasta and pizza we ate, if I couldn't go back there, I don't know what I'd do. It's the best holiday ever as well.
Well, you hear a lot too. You hear a lot, guys they'll go to Italy for a holiday and they'll eat pizza and bread and all this, and they'll go, oh, I didn't have a single issue eating gluten and wheat and all that stuff in Italy. They must just have different wheat than we have here. But then they go to Sainsbury or they go wherever and they buy pasta, that was in Italy, and they have a reaction to it. Like it probably has less to do with the pasta and the bread and all that. It probably has more to do with the environment you're putting yourself into, which is I'm stressed out all the time. My tolerance to things are going to go down. If I go on holiday and the stress goes down, all of a sudden my tolerance goes up.
Interesting. Yeah, super interesting, isn't it? That little example as well. It's amazing.
Yeah. Stress, your brain controls everything. When I lived in Texas, I would tell clients to go on holiday. I'd have a business owner that hadn't had a holiday in 10 years and they're getting zero results, even though they're being great on everything. I'm like, listen, I want you to take 2 weeks and I want you to go to Mexico and I want you to sit on the beach and I want you to drink beer and eat burritos. I don't give a shit what you do. I don't want you to diet or train. And they would lose weight and they'd come back and they'd be like, okay, I got it. I just need to drink beer and eat Mexican food all day. That's the solution. It's like, no, the solution is to put your body in the environment that you had in Mexico, which is you need to start taking more time for yourself and de-stressing, because that's ultimately what's controlling your digestive issues.
So just on that, so looking at the gut, let's just go back to the gut health. So I got another question about gut health here. It's about poo, so I know you'll like this question. Someone said, given on a day-to-day basis, their dietary intake may change to eating different things every day. How do they know, given on a day-to-day basis, their dietary intake may change their poop basically every day because they're eating different things. How do they know whether they've managed to kind of maintain optimal gut health if they're really trying to kind of keep their gut nice and healthy? What markers are they looking for if their kind of poop is changing day to day?
I mean, yeah, if your poop is changing day to day, the best thing to do is keep a food log and just kind of saying, okay, if I wake up and I'm basically spackling my toilet with diarrhea, what did I eat the day before? Because that's probably what's going to be the issue. And, gut health can get pretty deep and intense. And it's another one of those things we know a little bit about a very complex system in the body. So what I'll typically tell people to do is if you want to eliminate all doubt, go do a stool analysis test, do a CDSA and see what's going on with your gut, right? Because you could have some type of imbalance that when you eat certain things, certain bacteria will react in a certain manner. So like I normally don't run tests for people. I normally try to fix things before I order an expensive test, right? Because in a lot of cases, a lot of the gut stuff, the same treatments help pretty much everything. But I would rather spend money on better lifestyle stuff and maybe some certain specific supplementation protocols. See if that alleviates a lot of it. If it doesn't, then we'll run a stool analysis. But one of my clients here in Australia, he's a pharmacist, so he has access to order all these tests, and he was doing fantastically well. He went to Croatia, did like a boats and hose type thing that they do out there. I don't know, went partying and all that, and went to Amsterdam and came home. And then all of a sudden, like, he was having all these massive issues with a bloat and gas, and like, he's got a six-pack, but his guts are blown out, diarrhea, all this. We can't figure out what it is. And I'm like, all right, just run a CDSA. And he has massive fungal overgrowth. There's a bunch of bacteria that's really off, like opportunistic bacteria that's really off. And so in a situation where it's extreme like that, then the best case thing to do is find somebody that can order you the right tests, and then run a protocol that's going to be very direct. Like for him, because he's a pharmacist, very easy for us to pick a good pharmaceutical antifungal, a good pharmaceutical antibacterial, and then also layer on top of that a lot of holistic type natural things for maintenance. But if you don't have a good doctor that that understands this type of stuff, then your best case scenario is keep a very diligent food log, and then see how you react to different foods, and see if eliminating those foods helps with the issue. And then taking those metrics, take your stress metrics. Are you sleeping well? Do you feel well rested? Do you have bags under your eyes? Do you have darkening under your eyes? Those are all symptoms. Do you have any type of fungal issues anywhere else? Athlete's foot, vaginal thrush, oral thrush, itchy bum hole, fingernail fungus. Like, these are all symptoms that you might have an issue where your gut bacteria has gotten a little bit out of balance.
So yeah, so like you say, in the absence of the kind of expensive tests, an elimination diet with a good kind of tracking protocol in terms of physical or your subjective experiences and how you're appearing, and then starting to reintroduce things would be a great way of kind of zeroing in on potential issues.
Yeah, for me, that's kind of the first line therapy, right? Let's see if it's the food or if it's the environment. So if I say, like the easiest thing to do is just take a piece of paper out and draw a line down the middle of it, put a yes on one side and a no on the other. Now, on the no side, you write down all the common things that you eat every week. You're not going to eat those for like 3 or 4 weeks. Okay, so let's say, like most people, eggs, chicken, beef. That'll be like their top 3 proteins that they eat. Then for a lot of people, it might be green beans, or, you write down peas, or you write down all the stuff you normally eat. We're not going to eat that stuff for like a month, maybe a month and a half. And let's try something different. Like, instead of chicken, let's have turkey. Instead of beef, let's have bison. Let's eat maybe some more fish and seafood, things like that, and see if that resolves the problem. If that resolves the problem, then we know it was the food creating the problem, and an elimination diet is probably going to be good to do, for a good 2 months, and then reintroduce foods one at a time. If they do an elimination diet and it doesn't get significantly better, then there's probably some type of pathology in their gut, and possibly an issue between their gut and their brain. At that point, they need to be referred out to speak to somebody who can actually do the right testing to see what's going on in the gut. Do I need an antifungal? Do I need an antibacterial? Do I need both? Which is usually the case. If you've got a fungal issue, you'll usually almost always have a bacterial issue as well. And I think one of the reasons that is because if you have long-term chronic stress, that's going to cause an overactivation of your immune system. Cortisol goes up to bring the immune system back down and kind of put it back under control. And once it does that, it tends to suppress your immune system, which then allows your gut to get dysbiotic. But, as far as what you can do for yourself, the elimination diet, maybe looking at, if you wanted to play around with some antimicrobials like black walnut, berberine, if you wanted to look at something like oil of oregano, if you want to look at like rosemary oil, like look at some volatile oils, then look at some antimicrobials. That stuff can go, you can try that for a few weeks to also see if that helps. If it doesn't, or you feel worse, then it's definitely time to get referred out and go see a doctor. Poop in a little bucket, they go and they analyze it, and then they'll tell you exactly what's in there, and then you can get very specific on how to treat that.
Okay, that's good. So another question I had was going back to another question that got sent to me was a couple of questions around that kind of someone who's flirting with type 2 diabetes. So they'd been having some high blood sugar readings, and they were looking at ways of managing that. So they were looking at potentially the best supplements or minerals or foods to help reduce or bring down blood sugars.
Okay. All right. So let's start with food, because everything should be food based and supplement secondary. So we'll talk food and training. Number one, get your aerobic work in. I'm telling you, man, that's going to be the best thing. Number one is that. Number two is obviously resistance training. The majority of where you hold glycogen, the biggest depot is going to be in type 2X fibers. So you're going to want to lift with, you don't want to lift with heavy weights, but you do want to lift to technical failure. Okay. So lifting in like bodybuilder rep ranges. So if we're looking at like hypertrophy rep ranges, strength endurance rep ranges, and making sure that you take it down to where you're getting it like one ugly rep and you're done. Like the minute you get one ugly rep, that's the end. You've pretty much fatigued everything you need to. If I can grow more type 2X fiber and type 2A fiber, glycogen, right? So that will be helpful. If I'm also doing some of the higher rep stuff, like the hypertrophy and the strength endurance stuff, and if I'm doing some aerobic training, then that's going to build more mitochondria that allows me to manage that flow of energy through the cell and through the mitochondria. So that's going to be helpful. The third thing is sleep. A lot of people that I see that are having issues, especially with metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes, they are not prioritizing sleep. Sure. If you don't sleep, your blood sugar rises, all right? And then it makes you basically insulin resistant the rest of the day. Making sure you're doing simple lifestyle stuff like walking more, like not worrying about hitting like 20,000 steps a day. But you know, if you're in London and you're one tube station away and it's a 15-minute walk to that tube station, get off early and walk the 15 minutes and just try to do simple stuff like that. Park further away from things. It's the easy stuff. And then looking at things like, you know, if you're sitting at home and you're not doing anything and you're watching, you know, Netflix, sit on the floor and do some nice light stretching. Just do some static stretching. You know, what we really need to do more of to be able to get more glucose into the cell and get it out of the bloodstream is we need more muscular contraction. Okay. So that doesn't necessarily mean lifting weights more. All you need is to contract the muscle. When you contract the muscle, you become glucose sensitive, and that is different than insulin sensitive. So even if I'm like, after we get off this, I'm going to go watch the new episodes of The Last Dance. And what I can do, I've been sitting at a desk all day working. So what I can do while I'm there is I can just flex muscles for 20 or 30 or 40 seconds. And that's enough contraction to make your cells more glucose sensitive. That's really easy stuff people can do at a desk when they're at work and no one even knows you're doing it. Stretching is the same thing. If I go into a deep static stretch, the muscles are contracting to protect joints. Okay. If I can hold that, that makes me more glucose sensitive. So the more stuff I can do to become glucose sensitive and to burn through energy and to build more mitochondria, the easier it's going to be to regulate my blood sugar.
So would that be a good thing to do before eating, doing like a body scan of contract and relax or some stretching before a meal?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's also the case to train multiple times a day. And when I say multiple times a day, I'm not meaning like going in and, you know, maybe working up to 1 rep max in the morning and then going back in the afternoon and doing functional hypertrophy and then coming back in the evening and doing like giant sets. What I'm saying is like, when you wake up in the morning, okay, wake up, have your cup of coffee, have a pee and a poo, and then do like 10 minutes of stretching, or do 10 minutes of yoga, do 10 minutes of sun salutation, do 10 minutes of sprawls, just something to get the body moving. Okay. Then at lunch, maybe you're contracting all your muscles, or you go out for a quick brisk 10-minute walk before you eat. That type of thing. Then, you know, in the evening you go and you hit your training, and then you make sure you get a good night's sleep. I mean, it's really the simple stuff that's screwing people up. It's not what they're doing dedicated in the gym. It's what they're not doing outside of the gym. And I had a long talk with, I've got like some herniated lumbar discs right now. And so the physiotherapist I see, he works on the nervous system, then he works on the mechanical side. And so you're going to kind of see a theme going forward in all of the industries. We got to work on the brain and the nervous system, then we can work on the muscles and the mechanics. And so we had this a big talk about, look, you know, we can fix you. Like I can fix you with programming. He can fix you with the physio. But if you go home and you sit at your desk the same way you've been, that's going to negate all the hard work you've been doing. So it's the little basic everyday things that screw a lot of people up.
But I think maybe having a little bit of knowledge. Some people would say, so if we just say, just go for a walk, it's going to help your type, borderline type 2. It's like, well, that's not going to help. Why is that going to help? But having a little bit of knowledge around the kind of, what's happening on a cellular level, suddenly it's like, oh, okay, I can see how that actually is going to help. Let's do that.
It's like we talked about earlier, like sometimes you got to take a couple of steps back and sometimes you got to slow down before you go faster. And so in order to get somebody to buy into that, you have to explain, what's the benefit. It's all a sales process. I need you to do this because it's going to benefit you in this certain way. Now, as far as supplements are concerned, like if you're not taking a multivitamin, multimineral, then you don't need to worry about anything else, because that should be the base of everything. Something that has a good amount of B vitamins in it and the right forms of B vitamins. Like if you're going to buy a vitamin, buy a very good vitamin. Don't buy bullshit vitamin, right? There's no point, because then it becomes an anti-nutrient. But you need a lot of B vitamins in your biochemistry. You need a lot of magnesium, you need a lot of zinc, you need copper, you need manganese. There's a lot of things that you need that you're probably not going to be getting enough of in your food, at least not optimal values. Like you might be hitting the RDA, but hitting an optimal level is going to be a completely different story. And you're always going to be bottlenecked at what cofactors you have to drive those processes. So if I don't have enough of certain B vitamins, certain things aren't going to work as fast as they're supposed to, right? So that would be my first thing. The second thing is to stay away from glucose disposal agents. There's a lot of people will take glucose disposal agents because what they're doing is they're just trying to lower the number on their glucometer. What they're not understanding is, yes, initially that will lower the number on the glucometer. If you're waking up and you're at 8 millimoles on your glucometer and you take a glucose disposal agent, it might drop down to 6.5 in a few weeks. The problem that you're not understanding is you're shoving glucose into a cell that doesn't want it for some specific reason. It makes more sense to build more mitochondria first. Then if you need a glucose disposal agent, knock yourself out. If you're going to take anything, especially with high fasting blood sugar, you're probably going to want to take something like berberine. Okay, because one of the main things that berberine does is it dampens down your liver's ability to manufacture glucose. And because that's really where you're getting the glucose from, is high adrenaline is going to crank up gluconeogenesis. Your liver is going to start making a lot of glucose. And now you wake up and you've got really high levels of glucose. There's one point where you need to get that into the cell, but there's another point where you need to get the liver to stop making so much of it. And that's why doctors will put people on metformin, because one of the main actions, other than just making you more insulin sensitive, it also pushes down the liver's ability to make glucose. So then it makes your glucose look a lot better. But again, that stuff, those are Band-Aids. Those aren't long-term solutions, right? We still have to take care of the getting more fit and getting more healthy on the side too.
So you touched on it, but another question from the same chap was, he's been having high waking blood sugars, but pre and post prandial generally now are, after starting to input some aerobic conditioning, and it's like calorie deficit, bringing carbohydrates down, and a lot of the things that are being recommended, the daytime readings tend to be okay, but the morning reading is always pretty much over where it should be.
Yeah, so some of the tactics we'll use with that is we might give somebody 500 to 1,000 milligrams of berberine before bed. Okay, so we might do that. We also might do a sleep assessment and say, okay, are you waking up a lot? Are you waking up to pee a lot at night? Typically, they'll say yes. Okay, so just so that we have the fundamental stuff down, how are your sleeping arrangements? Is it completely dark in your room? Is it cold enough in your room? Does your partner sleep with you and they have weird sleeping habits and that's keeping you up? Do you sleep with dogs? That's my wife and I actually have separate bedrooms. And the reason we have separate bedrooms, and we'll spend the night with each other a couple of nights a week, but the majority of the time we don't, because she loves to sleep with the dogs. Then the dogs screw my sleep up. And Zoe, you could drop Zoe in the middle of a war zone, bombs going off, and she could sleep, but I can't.
Yeah.
So I want her to be able to sleep with the dogs because she enjoys that, but I also want to get good sleep. So I sleep in a separate bedroom. So those are things you got to talk about. Is there any light coming in from a street lamp or something like that? Maybe we get you some blackout curtains. Maybe are you in the middle of town? There's a lot of noise. Maybe get a white noise machine or play white noise stuff on your cell phone. You want to make sure that there's taking care of the sleep. Because like I said earlier, if you're not sleeping well and sleeping soundly, your blood sugar is going to be artificially raised. So if we correct the sleeping habits, then we can take some berberine, and then we might actually have a meal a couple hours before bed to make sure we have ample amounts of liver glycogen. So we might do something like a little bit of honey with a little bit of sodium. So that will quickly replenish liver glycogen. The sodium will help keep you from having to wake up to pee at night. And then we'll also mix that in with maybe a little bit of Greek yogurt, because there's been some pretty good studies showing that casein protein before bed creates an environment for you to be anti-catabolic while you sleep. So that makes a really nice, yummy treat for people if they have like a bowl, like a cup of berries with some Greek yogurt, maybe drizzle some honey on top and throw a little bit of sea salt on that, mix it up and have that at the end of the day before you go to bed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've heard that before, actually, but not in that context of managing kind of, high blood sugars in the morning. But I like that.
And then there's some other things too, like, there could be issues with serotonin and melatonin. When people are very stressed out and anxious, when you're very stressed out and your body's breaking energy down rapidly, it consumes a lot of activated B3. So there's a system that creates more of that activated B3 where you still tryptophan away from the brain to make that. If you can't get tryptophan into the brain, you're not making enough serotonin. If you don't make enough serotonin, you're not going to make melatonin. So in a lot of cases too, we'll give someone a small amount of melatonin to see if that helps. And if it does, then what we'll probably do is work on, if they're not on an SSRI or not on any type of antidepressant, we might give them a little bit of B6 and 5-HTP and see if that helps. And that usually takes care of a lot of things. There's a lot of different angles you can go on to get somebody to sleep better, which almost always is going to lower their fasting glucose. And if it doesn't, in a lot of cases, I find a lower carb diet, a lower carb approach works pretty well too, as long as they're not in a massive caloric deficit.
Sure. So actually not coupling the 2, calorie deficit and low carb, maybe having one or the other.
Yeah, so maybe beefing up the protein quite a bit. Making sure you're having adequate amounts of good quality fatty acids. And then when I say low carb, I'm not talking like going straight keto, right? I'm talking like low carb for you and your activity. So like low carb for me is 125 grams a day. When I'm doing jiu-jitsu, low carb for me is like 500 a day, right? It's, when you're training like 15 hours a week plus conditioning and a little bit of weight training, you're going to need it, right? But for somebody who's really overweight, there's no real inherent need for carbohydrates whatsoever other than probably fiber and some phytonutrients. So if they're really overweight, we'll probably take them down to a fairly low carb and put them more on a ketogenic style diet for a small period of time. So that way they don't get those reactive hypoglycemia issues.
And then we're looking back at that kind of metabolic flexibility and improving people's use of different substrates, I suppose.
Exactly. And once they lose a good amount of weight, they lose a good amount of inflammation from that fat loss, then eventually their carbs start to go up because they're going to need those because the performance goes up. And their body wants more carbs.
Okay, look, that we've covered so much different stuff. It's gonna be such. I knew it was going to be like this from the course, but we've just covered so much stuff. It's so interesting. I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I'm sure you've got stuff planned. But I'll ask you a couple more questions just to finish off. So we've actually already covered this in massive detail, but just as probably a little bit of a summary for the whole podcast, really, is I tend to ask people what are their 3 best tips for people for improving or optimizing their health and performance. So we've obviously already covered a lot of it, but just as a little soundbite, what are your 3 best tips for improving health and performance?
I think one thing is that to not put all your eggs in one basket. Like don't be married to a method or an idea. And don't be married to your passion either, because passion can really mess you up. And there's a book I highly recommend people. If if you like to read, and if you like to read, especially fantasy, I'm a big fantasy and sci-fi fan, so like Dune and other books. And I tend to read, what I find is a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, it tells a story, but there's also lessons that you could learn from the characters and things. And so there's a book called Wizard's First Rule. And in it, there's 13 wizard's rules that every wizard kind of lives by. And one of them is, the rule is passion rules reason. So if I get, and the whole concept of the book is that reason should always be the cornerstone of all your decisions. Like, it either makes sense or it doesn't, and don't allow your passion to override your sense of reason. That way you don't do dumb shit. So, you know, I love to lift heavy. I love to squat, but right now I've got lower lumbar herniations. I can't squat. I have to do step ups and split squats. I have to work around it as much as I want to. Doing too much squatting and ignoring the niggles is what got me to a point where now I can't squat. So, or I'm having to like relearn how to squat. So tip number one is never let your passion destroy your performance and health.
Great tip.
Okay. Point number two is make sure that you're getting information from multiple places. Like, don't sit in an echo chamber and get your information from just the people who you think are the experts. Don't appeal to authority. You see that a lot, especially in the evidence-based crowd, is just because somebody's name is on a bunch of research articles, it doesn't mean they have a good grasp on reality, because what happens in a lab is usually very, very different than what happens in real life. Especially when you put humans' brains and what they're going to do and what, you know, how they're going to act outside of a lab. So making sure that you're learning and getting information from as many places as you can on how to control your health, and then making sure that the shit makes sense, right? It's like we said with the NHS, you know, God bless the NHS, but, you know, sometimes doctors don't do what we do, and we don't do what doctors do. So sometimes they're not the best people to get advice on nutrition and lifting and conditioning and training on, because they're not taught that stuff, right? So you don't want to, just because a doctor says something doesn't mean that that's the way it needs to be. And you got to put everything else in context. Just like if I've got an overweight diabetic, losing that first 10%, and then every 10% they lose is going to massively increase their health. But what do I tell the guy who's not at that level yet? He's just got type 2 diabetes and he's really skinny because he's lost all his muscle mass. Like, I can't tell him to lose weight. So I want to make sure I've got multiple inputs of where I'm getting my information from, so that I can give both of those people their independent prescription that's going to be based for them specifically. The third one is just fucking move more, man. Jesus, like, if you come in and you train with a trainer 3 days a week, that is not your only exercise. Like, don't go train with your trainer for 3 sessions a week and give yourself a good pat on the back and be like, okay, dude, I'm done for the week. Bro, there's another 165 hours a week, right? You need to be getting your good quality sleep. You need to make sure you're moving more. If you sit at a desk like I do all day, get up every hour and a half, 2 hours, and go for a 20-minute walk. Like, and think about taking care of the simple shit before you think about taking care of the complex shit. You know, if you don't know how to eat, you don't know how to diet, then stick to what we know works. Eat a lot of veggies, garnish it with meat, you know, make sure you drink a lot of fluids. That's pretty much as basic as it gets, right? So don't get confused and razzle-dazzled. Take care of the fundamental things before you decide to get crazy and do the hoodoo, voodoo, complex things.
Great advice. Yeah, brilliant advice. You know, you can't beat that, really, isn't it? It's just taking things back to basics for people, you know, so that they're not trying to like go down that wormhole of finding a specific nutrient that's going to cure all my ills. And it's like, well, let's just do what you need to do first. You know, hit those basic like kind of things that we need to be hitting, and then we can think about those more kind of in-depth aspects of kind of health and nutrition.
Everyone wants to know what the secret is, and I can tell you, I know what the secret is. I can tell you exactly what the secret is. Be very consistent, patient, and do it for a long fucking time. Consistency is the secret. Being very compliant, staying on track, and doing that for a very long time is always the best long-term solution.
Amazing. So, Luke, where can people where can people get hold of you? If people want to work with you, other coaches want to work with you, or clients want to get hold of you and kind of work with you guys, how can they get hold of you?
Yeah, so they can email us at info@musclenerds.net. We have also got our Instagram, which is musclenerds_health. We're also on Facebook. You just look up Muscle Nerds. So any of those avenues, if like coaches want to learn this stuff, like what you learned in the foundation stuff, the program design, we've got a couple of other things we do. We do mentorships, like long-term mentorships, online training. We do all that stuff. And pretty soon we'll have a gym, hopefully, to train at. If we don't open the gyms in Australia pretty soon, this might be the fastest purchase and bankruptcy of a gym ever. So.
Oh God, I hope not.
Me too.
All right, Luke, it's been great having you on, and I know anyone listening to this would have got a hell of a lot out of this, and be able to take some actionable points away to their training and their life and their wellness. So really appreciate you coming on, and hopefully we'll be able to have you back, because I've got a list of subjects that we just touched on that I think we could just do whole podcasts about in themselves. So really appreciate you coming on, man.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. And anytime you want to do it, just let me know. I'm happy to get on.
Will do. Thank you.
Okay, guys. Wow, what an amazing interview. I'm just thrilled to be able to kind of pick Luke's brains about those different subjects. I mean, we covered a lot of different subjects, from kind of how to train, athletes to be well conditioned for their sport, to gut health, to training for health and well-being. We've covered a lot of different stuff there, so I hope there are some takeaways that you can start actioning and putting into your lifestyle and your training, and I hope there's some good stuff in there that's going to help you. Fire me any questions that you've got about anything that we spoke about, and get in contact with Luke and the Muscle Nerds guys if you want their support, because they are really some of the top guys in the industry at the moment. Look, get over to our website, sign up to the Performance Hub as well, because there's a lot of information on there in the kind of ballparks that we discussed today. So if you're looking for more content around these subjects, the Performance Hub is a great place to go to start reading more and learning more about these subjects. We're also going to be running some challenges on the Performance Hub. So we're going to have everything that you need to start training and living towards a healthier lifestyle, laying those baseline qualities of aerobic fitness and movement quality that we spoke in depth about today. We're going to have a whole guide and a whole kind of setup challenge, if you like, on the members site. So keep your eyes out for that. It's going to be our Survive to Thrive challenge. It's going to be for guys and girls who are looking to take their training to the next level by laying the baseline qualities that you need, those foundational qualities of aerobic capacity, of good movement quality, of maintaining and supporting your well-being, your mental well-being, as well as your physical well-being. So keep your eyes out for that challenge, because it's going to be really great, and it's going to be coming in the next few weeks. Go and hit up Luke on his socials, hit us up on our socials. If you can comment, like, and share on these podcasts, it really helps us to be able to get great guests like Luke. And stay tuned, because we've got some really great guests coming up. Next week we've got a real big guest, so keep an eye on our social for that one, and we'll see you next time.